In the
being a kid, being a regular 9-year-old Canadian kid growing up in Vancouver over my parents' grocery store, 477 Powell Street. They had tobaccos and vegetables and fruit, an ice cream soda fountain and candy. My mom sold candy. My dad, he delivered milk, so he was pretty well known in that Vancouver Japanese community.
On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. On December 8, they attacked Hong Kong. Long-standing anti-Japanese sentiments were ignited, compelling the Canadian government to declare that arising out of war with Japan, it is deemed necessary for the security and defense of Canada to conduct the evacuation of every person of Japanese race from British Columbia.
They confiscated everything. The government took everything. The grocery store, brand new milk truck. They said held in trust, but we never got it back. So it must have been sold or whatever. Dad never really talked about it, My parents shielded us from all that. So, I don't even remember going to the camp at New Denver. It was a train, but the next thing I remember is we were in a tent at New Denver, wooden floor and a tent. But then living in under a tent, I guess, was a novelty, It felt like a real camp, middle of the Rocky Mountains, right in front of a big lake and a ball field. I remember that's where I learned how to swim. It was just like growing up anywhere else. Inside the camp. There wasn't a fence as such, not a barbed wire. But we were in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. There was nowhere to go.
On August 6, 1945, the world's first atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 9 days later, the war was over. Japan surrendered. By December of that year, a full 4 months after the end of the war, the Canadian government, responding to pressure from British Columbia politicians and public opinion, kept a wartime promise that for the security and welfare of Canada, every naturalized Japanese Canadian, every natural-born Japanese Canadian, could and should be deported to Japan.
We didn't know what it was really, going to Japan or going to the interior or going somewhere else. There was no going home though. Even at that age we knew Vancouver was restricted. Except to ship us out. We left the camp the fall of '46 onto a troop ship in Vancouver and landed in Yokosuka Japanese Naval Base. It seemed like forever. Then we were herded into army barracks. The food was brought in buckets. We ended up in my grandfather's village, small, real poor, middle of nowhere.
March 31, 1949 signaled the last of the federal government restrictions on Japanese Canadians, thereby allowing unrestricted travel and permitting settlement anywhere within Canada.
When we were deported to Japan, my oldest brother George was 18. He could have stayed in Canada, but he came with us. So when he heard about the orders being rescinded, his resentment to Canada just got bigger and bigger. He knew then just how much had been taken, from us kids especially.
In 1950, the United Nations sent a multinational armed force into Korea in what it called a policing action against communist North Korean aggressions. The Canadian government provided troops to the UN effort, and the Canadian Army in Japan recruited those Canadians exiled in 1946. Almost 40 exiles volunteered.
In 1950, I turned 18. I remember something in the paper said the Canadian Army was looking for us who still had Canadian citizenship to join to fight in Korea for the United Nations and Canada. I must have wondered, how come they forced us to Japan and now they were recruiting us to fight? I mean, Canada only ever saw me as Japanese, but I'd always been a Canadian. So the Canadian Army, I guess, was how I saw getting back to the only home I knew or didn't know. I wonder sometimes about the justice. In 1942, the Canadian government labeled me an enemy, sent me into exile. To a 9-year-old child, it seemed just another part of growing up, a part of life. But children don't know right or wrong. I mean, interning us during the war, giving us that narrow alternative of either going to Japan or going where we were sent. I thought it happened to everyone, not just the Japanese. In 1953, after Korea, I got to come back and be a Canadian. To start over. To have justice, in a way.
My father came home and rebuilt his life. In the process, many things were left, best forgotten and unspoken. Those silences are a large part of my identity, my other heritage. But my Canadianness is complete, totally natural, immutable. My father affirmed his in the face of hatred and oppression. I am a Canadian because he struggled to remain a Canadian. On September 22, 1988, the Canadian government acknowledged the injustices committed against Japanese Canadians during and after World War II. A comprehensive settlement was achieved, which included symbolic redress payments to eligible persons still alive on September 22, 1988, a community activities fund, and the establishment of a Canadian Race Relations Foundation.